I really think that the organizers, which I was not one of this program, really sort of had a great segue here between what John was talking about and our next speaker, Rick Danvier, who is working on a ranch, has been for quite some time, and is going to talk a little bit about how they've been able to successfully manage at Deseret Land and Livestock for maintaining sagebrush steppe while watching the bottom line. And Rick has been at Deseret Land and Livestock as a wildlife biologist since 1983 after completing his degree in wildlife science from Utah State University. And he's been the wildlife manager at Deseret since 1990. And he's been very active in a lot of different wildlife related activities across the state. He's very well respected in a lot of different fields, and I'm really pleased to have him give our last talk of the day.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me? Okay. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, Deseret Land and Livestock is right there, just over the hill from Logan here on the Utah-Wyoming border. It's about 200,000 private acres, 15,000 public acres, BLM land that we graze. Elevation ranges from 6,300 up to 8,700 feet. Average precip down in the eastern half of the ranch, the lowland sage steppe country, is about 10 inches, and about 18 inches up in the mountain sage. And the wettest months of the year, September, April, May, June. A brief history. The ranch was established in 1891. Began as a sheep ranch and running up to 60,000 ewes in its heyday. Switched to cattle in the mid-1960s. It was purchased by the current owner in 1983. Bill Hopkin, my old boss, likes to point out that we were budgeted to lose a significant amount of money in 1983, and we achieved our goal. But as the economists will point out, the land that doesn't return on investment does risk change in ownership or land use. And in this part of the country, a lot of it starts to grow homes instead of habitat. And so, needless to say, we were in need of a new plan. So the resource here that we've got to work with, the easiest way to think of it in my mind is we've got some very major irrigated land. These meadows here. It's only about between 5 and 10% of the ranch, but actually accounts for about 50% of the cattle forage. We've got a low elevation country that's been planted to crested wheatgrass in the 1960s. So this mid elevation area that at the time that back in '83 was pretty much just native sage. Not a lot had been done to it. Our Wasatch grassland here, which is kind of unique. I'll show you some pictures. Much more grass dominated than sagebrush dominated. And the mountain. So the low elevation crested wheatgrass that's being repopulated with sagebrush. The mid elevation Wyoming and Basin Big Sage country. Wasatch grassland and the mountain. So that's what we had to work with. The ranch was purchased in 1983 by the LDS Church. We developed a mission statement to maximize profit while enhancing the ranch resources, serving the community, and being an ensign of the church. And some of the people in charge at the time, Greg Simon was probably the big driver with this, and Bill Hopkin, made an awful big part of making this thing happen. But both of them really believe that managing for diversity of enterprises and habitats promotes both economic and ecological stability. That having a diverse enterprises and habitats provides us the flexibility to maintain production and populations despite the fluctuations that the markets and the climate throw at you. Diversity equals stability. We just felt like we really needed to look at the resource and figure out how we could stay in business. Because we're one of those groups that really was profit driven. That if we couldn't make the ranch pay for itself, they were going to hire another bunch of guys and see if they could make it pay for itself. So we started some other businesses. We started a hunting program, a fishing program, bird watching, still kept some sheep grazing going on. But the big driver, of course, is cattle production. So our management program, I guess the way we'll talk about it today, it involves, in broad brush, determining some economic and ecological goals, time-controlled grazing, research and monitoring, adaptive management. So use what we learn from monitoring to reset goals and change our strategies, and then some range restoration projects. So in terms of wildlife, some of these sagebrush obligate species, for example, pretty much we're trying, by species, we determine whether we wanted to increase, maintain, or decrease the abundance of them, which is about, some of the main, really a lot of what we're trying to do with species. We'd like to have more sage grouse, more ferruginous hawks, more mule deer. But in the process, we like to maintain viable populations, at least of brewer sparrows, sage thrashers, and pygmy rabbits. Now, those are our goals. And then we'd actually like to decrease the abundance of Rocky Mountain elk on the ranch. And like I say, Mike Wolf showed you this slide earlier. I mean, as you can see, you've got a whole suite of species that do well in some of this lower brush cover and height type country. Some of the country on a ranch tends to want to be this kind of country. Some of it tends towards this, and some of it you can kind of shift either way fairly easily. So you've got a suite of species like prairie dogs and pronghorns and vesper sparrows and ferrugs that like this more open country. You've got another little suite that likes this denser brush, and then some things like mule deer and elk and sage grouse that seem to use the full suite. And it becomes pretty obvious that you can't take the same acre and try to maximize these species as well as maximizing these species. It's not going to happen. So, like with anyone else, that's our goal. But we've tried to use some of the information that people have put out that you've heard speak today, and see what kind of a job we can do of this. We believe that the most important thing we do for both the economics and the ecology of the ranch, the most important thing we do for wildlife is to graze right. That means manage the time and the timing of grazing. So we're providing rest for recovery in our grazing system. Rest makes healthy plants. We're also grazing, though, for profit and to increase protein and energy on the range. So we're resting pastures until they're regrown. We generally rest at least 12 months before we come back to a pasture. We're managed using short grazing periods, high stock densities, a few herds, and multiple pastures. We believe what it's doing is mimicking the effects of native ungulate herds on the landscape. Just an example here. Since we're using just a few herds, small number of herds, but they're large herds, you've got 90% of the cattle on 10% of the land at any one time during the growing season. The red pasture, just to kind of orient you again, these yellow blocks are BLM. These black lines denote pasture boundaries, and this, of course, would be the boundary of the entire ranch. So you can see you just have cattle in a few pastures at any one time. The rest of those pastures then are recovering. We believe this kind of a strategy provides rest for recovery, reduces rebiting of individual preferred plants. Since the animals don't have the option of just walking around and eating just the things they like, it reduces diet selectivity and increases diet breadth. They eat a greater variety of plants. They're eating sagebrush. If they walk around just looking for ice cream plants, they're going to die. It maintains the diversity of plant growth forms. Grasses, forbs, and shrubs all receive some herbivory. Allows greater management flexibility of rest pastures of various season of use, better opportunities for litter and seed production, increases herbaceous plant density, cover, and production, and improves water infiltration and riparian health. I mean, you can just see a couple of pastures here, one that was grazed fairly heavily in May, but then regrown in September. We saw improvement in riparian areas in just a few years, where, in many of these riparian areas like this would started out not nearly in this good a shape because you had a small number of cattle in the pasture all summer long. like I said, rest allows plants to recover, but we've also seen that too much rest is not necessarily helping us meet our goals. Here's a pasture, or the area inside this fence, as you can see, is covered with the Canadian thistle after being rested for 5 years from cattle grazing. You can see the areas outside. There's Canadian thistle out in here in places too, but it's just a component of the plant community as opposed to essentially a monoculture. On range, we've seen some interesting patterns too. Basically, these exclosures that have been rested now for about 15 years, what we've seen every year during that time is that we saw greater shrub production and less forb production in the ungrazed areas inside the exclosures than we did where the cattle were grazing. So essentially the cattle grazing, the time control grazing, is keeping forbs in the system and reducing shrub cover. What we really think we're seeing is that so often the debate seems to be between, is grazing better than rest? Is grazing good or is it bad? But what we're seeing is that we believe that we're leaving out this middle ground, the idea of alternatively grazing and rest. Intermittent herbivory and rest is much preferable to either season-long grazing or total rest. It seems kind of paradoxical, but periodic rest allows a perennial plant density and vigor to increase, particularly in riparian areas. Conversely, the disturbance that results from the intermittent herbivory, the grazing, greens up the herbaceous plants and keeps early cereal species, weeds, in the plant community, increasing digestible protein and energy. You've got green grass, you've got green forbs out on the landscape. And as Mike Wolf was saying earlier, that's what makes babies. That's what makes fat cows. That's what makes more sage grouse. So again, just to kind of, because we really feel the most important thing we're doing is grazing, right? We'll just have a few pictures up in Rich County. Here's a one pasture grazing system. Everybody like the looks of the riparian area in there? That's your public land. Now there's a three pasture system. So basically, all of these areas are areas where you're going to graze from mid-May to mid-September. So in this one, you've got cattle in there for 6 months, and here you only got cattle in for a couple of months. Just that shortening that up that much and allowing part of the season for rest or recovery makes the riparian area look better. There's a 12 pasture system. Take 6 months, divide it by 12. You're in for a couple of weeks. And here's a 20 pasture system down on Deseret. I really think that you're going to see that kind of riparian recovery. I would venture pretty much anywhere in the Intermountain West simply by, not by taking less forage out of the pasture, but by doing it in a different manner, in a short period of time and allowing it to rest and recover. So again, a single pasture, 120 days, May 15th to September 15th annually. Are you going to get rebiting? Yeah, you got one pasture. You're going to bite. The plants that got bitten on day one are going to get bitten again before that 120 days runs out. You can't vary the season of use. It's the same every year. You're not going to produce any seed, at least where the grazing occurred. You're not going to leave any cover where the grazing is occurring. There may be portions of the pasture far from water that don't get bitten, and you will have some old cover and litter. Do you really have any flexibility? And are you getting any rest? Not really. You're going to have overgrazed and overrested plants in the same pasture. So, just in contrast, a three pasture system with troughs that you can turn on and off. So essentially it's like a 6 pasture system. You've shortened the season of use to 20 days from 120 days. Now you can vary the season of use. You could start in a different pasture every year. You're going to get seed, these pastures that you graze early in the year, you're going to allow them to go to produce seed behind you. There's going to be cover produced behind you. You're going to get some litter. You're going to build some things and put some litter on the ground. So it's a preferential way of doing it. Same number of cattle, just using the landscape in a different way. So in summary, shortening the grazing periods and lengthening the rest period improved herbaceous plant vigor and cover on both riparian and range sites. Long-term rest resulted in increased brush growth and decreased forb growth on range and increased thistle abundance in the meadows. As far as monitoring, we've got a certain amount of money. We're trying to make a profit. So we obtain the best information we can afford, but remember that all important decisions must be made based on insufficient data. I think that might have been a Lucy Jordan that came up with that. So, some monitoring results. We found the grouse and pronghorn production, chicks per hens, fawns per 100 does, was higher in native sagebrush stands that had higher forb abundance than in the crested wheatgrass stands, which had low forb abundance. Thought that was interesting. Basically, where you had 3 times the forbs, you had 3 times the production. Just like they taught us back in Wildlife 101, forbs may be important for some of these things. Some other monitoring results we picked up were just that the grouse populations, for example, declined following deep snow winters and failed to increase in dry summers. It seemed like the extreme weather years were driving the population change. In a tough winter, a lot of the sagebrush on our range got covered up. The sage grouse had to concentrate in the remaining brush, and the eagles worked them over pretty good. Same thing in the summer. Dry summers, they concentrated in the riparian areas. It seemed like you saw increased predation and competition for food in the extreme years, and also decreased cover and nutrition. There's only about 10% of the ranch is native meadows. But something Bill Hopkin noticed flying over the ranch one day is he looked down in a god-awful drought year, and he saw that on some old oil pads that had been reclaimed, you had deep-rooted legumes on these oil pads, and they were bright green. And he went out and took a look at them, and sure enough, that's where the jackrabbits were, and the cows, and the pronghorns. Functionally, these deep-rooted alfalfa plants were acting kind of like a meadow. They still had bright green protein and energy available when the rest of the range was dried out. So we said, all right, well, what if we could increase digestible protein and energy on another 5 to 10% of the ranch by thinning brush and or increasing forb availability? Especially thinking about the oil pad example, adding deep-rooted forbs in some potential brood rearing areas. Would sage grouse and pronghorn use these areas? Now, obviously, a lot of this was aimed at cattle and elk and mule deer and things that make us money. But we were really curious if we could do it and also improve sage grouse and pronghorn as well. So would we see more sage grouse and pronghorn? Would they use those areas, and would they produce more young? So in 1993 we started a series of range treatments. Many of them were plantings that were primarily intended to increase grass production for cattle and elk, summer cattle and winter elk. A variety of native and introduced grasses, forbs, and browse were planted. Our desire was to increase cattle and elk forage on the landscape, increase our revenues, while maintaining or enhancing habitat for other species like sage grouse, mule deer, and, as I said, sage thrashers. Do we have to make those go away in order to increase revenue from the big grass grazers? So, increased diversity, abundance of nutritious plants. We wanted to restore the desired function on the landscape. We created early cereal patches in dense sagebrush, interspersed with mature sagebrush. We tried to increase herbaceous production, especially of forbs. Since 1993, we've treated about 1 to 2% of the range per year, or about 1,500 acres per year, on average. And we're starting to slow down in the last couple of years and trying to really evaluate what's worked and what we liked and what we didn't like. We used a variety of techniques. In places we used the disc and end printer and just made a new plant community. Other areas we just used these various sagebrush mangling techniques, like smashing them with an aerator, burning them with fire, or taking the sagebrush out with tebuthyron. The cool season burns that we tried were probably the cheapest method, although there is some opportunity costs, as John talked about, in that you have to you need some herbaceous fuel to carry a cool season burn. You need some grass on the ground, last year's grass, so it requires rest from grazing. Now, with the time-controlled grazing strategy, that's not necessarily an opportunity lost because we were planning on doing some rest anyway. What it does is removes brush cover where you burn. It increases early cereal forbs and plant protein. You see a lot of plants pop up after a burn that you didn't see before. It can be done on steep slopes, remains thin for 10 plus years in the mountain sage and 20 plus in the Wyoming sage. May require an ARC survey. Kind of goes where it goes. It's difficult to necessarily make it do exactly what you want. Found that out a couple years, didn't we, Bill? Bill had the Greater Evanston Airport fairly worked up a couple of times. And it does require some post-treatment rest. Or doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily require post-treatment rest. We've actually started playing around from a wildlife point of view. I believe resting after a burn for a couple of years does a really good job of getting the perennial grasses back in. From a wildlife point of view, I was not necessarily in any hurry to get the perennial grasses back in. If by grazing it following burning, it took a little bit longer for the grasses to come in, and I hung on to the weeds a little bit longer, those high protein forbs, that was doing me good. And to some degree, to a large degree, doing the cattle good. And I need you to understand that our area wants to be perennial grasses. I mean, if we go out and do a treatment, we get cheatgrass that moves in, but usually within 2 or 3 years, because of the ecological site and because I think also the time control grazing, it goes away pretty quickly. So we don't have a situation where we get taken over by cheatgrass. I don't think I would manage quite the same way if I was in Elko. So you can see some of the spring burns, the nice mosaic patterns. Here's a lower elevation spring burn. Get quite a bit of increased edge. Mule deer really seem to like it. Sage grouse. Mechanical thinning. We primarily use the Pasture aerator, but Dixie Harrow has some similar effects. More costly. You're probably looking at $15 to $30 an acre. I believe is what we generally felt we were spending, depending on whether we tried to add seed or not. That's without the archaeological survey. You have a greater ability to sculpt. You can kind of make it go where you want. Doesn't require herbaceous cover. It doesn't require any fuel. It thins rather than removing the brush, the sagebrush. The brush canopy cover increases back to 25%, generally in less than 10 years from what we've seen. But you could follow up and extend that open period if you so desired with a cool season burn, if you get on it while you still have some herbaceous plants in the mix. Produces fewer early cereal forbs than fire. It's confined to milder slopes. It's hard to run it on steeper slopes. Sometimes you can add some species, but it's really not the technique you would want to use if you want to really add a lot of new plants. If you want to add seed. There's a pretty good 5 minutes. Okay. There's an article or a little handbook put out by the Buffalo, Wyoming folks that did quite a bit of work with the aerator, available on the internet now, and that's essentially what they're finding is you don't want to, it's not a really good way to plant seeds. They found it very effective way of releasing native forbs though by dragging an aerator around. Does require an archaeological survey, which adds costs, and again, in my opinion, rest is not required, at least with time control grazing. We tried to do similar patterns with the aerator that we obtained with our cool season burns, patchy stuff. Now I don't know. I suppose this is the Dalmatian as opposed to the Holstein. And we've got we have places where we made little holes in a big sagebrush sea. Particularly if our old wildlife biologist, the late Steve Curl, was running the machine. We have other places that was ended up being more grassy with smaller islands. If we had an old retired cattleman running the tractor, as you might expect. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking these older sagebrush plants that have a lot of wood and not so much green growth and turning them into younger plants expressing a lot of vigorous growth. And a lot of what we were thinking of was down the line. We wanted to have some young plants coming in to replace the older plants. Have a variety of patches of sagebrush ages out there. We used spike in a few areas. We found the cost to be similar to mechanical treatments, $15 to $20 an acre, which in some respects is cheaper because it doesn't really doesn't require an arc survey. We weren't limited by slope. We flew it on. It was sagebrush specific, releases herbaceous and root sprouting woody species, produces fewer early cereal forbs than fire. The bitterbrush wasn't killed. Where we found that with fire in our mountain sage, we did kill some bitterbrush. Some lost to the fire and some lost to the follow-up browsing by mule deer, elk, cattle, sheep, whatever. Didn't seem to handle it that double whammy as well as most of the other root sprouters. Sagebrush recovery is slower than with fire or an aerator. The sagebrush seems to remain gone for a long time with spike. No arc survey was required, and rest, again, in my opinion, rest isn't required. So there's not a very good picture, but you can kind of see how the bitterbrush gets released with the spike treatments. Over across the way, Ryan Woodland's probably talking about supplemented sheep. We just have a little experience with it, but it has some interesting things that somewhat different results than you see with, say, an aerator. Again, it thins the sagebrush, but it also leaves tall sagebrush as well as the short sagebrush plants. We saw good herbaceous response. Again, produces fewer early cereal forbs than fire. Requires herders or fencing and supplementation. Shouldn't require an arc survey, and I don't believe you'd have to add any long rest period. You can see here, this would be not sheep grazed back here. This area here was grazed by sheep that weren't given a supplement, and this area here, the sheep were supplemented with an energy protein supplement. As you can see, it killed some sagebrush, but it left a fair amount too. I don't recall the difference. I'm going to say we took it from, say, 25 to 30% canopy cover down to more like 10 to 15. And then disking and planting. It was the most costly method by far, probably 2 to 3 times the mechanical or chemical costs. It was the best method for introducing new species. Certainly the best way to add legumes. Increases early cereal forbs and plant protein. You saw a real nice cereal forb response. When we did it, we essentially kept the plants that were there to begin with, plus we added new ones. We made one pass with a disc and then dragged the imprinter behind and planted. So we can either add to existing species or replace the existing plant community. It does require an arc survey, and it requires post-treatment rest. You really ought to rest it for 2 growing seasons. Just some photos of some of the plantings. Here we reclaimed a deep gully, disked it in and put some plants in it. Reclaimed road, oil pads. You can see some of the great legume response. And in this case, putting forage kochia in to make along existing roads to make fire breaks. So results. We see an increased use of planting, spiked, burned, and aerated areas on summer range, especially by deer, and increased use of plantings in winter, especially by cow-calf elk, especially where we had gone in and added forage kochia. We saw a significant increase in grouse use in burns and disked areas. That's used by broods, essentially, in the late brood season. We don't have very much data on this yet. We're trying to get a couple of more years worth of data, but we did see some similar type response, at least the first year that we did this, where grouse seemed to be using the aerated areas in the early brood season more than controls. So, as far as grouse production, we saw an increase in mean brood size from pre to post season, an increase in chick to hen ratios from pre to post season. So hens with broods are using the treatment areas. They seem to be making more young, and the population, the number of birds we're counting, has increased. Basically, we found more elects as time went on. Some of them probably existed even before the treatment period. Some of them are absolutely new. But as you can see, we're seeing we were counting 100 birds in 93. We're counting about 700 males currently on the same piece of property. As far as pronghorn response, we saw something similar. Doe fawn groups, selected the treatments much greater than available. And prior to doing these treatments, the population would get up to around 600 pronghorn and level off. They would remain level because they quit having young. Now I don't know whether we made it better or worse, but we now have a bigger pronghorn population that's producing lots of babies. The hunters love it, and it's an economic boon to us. So both the sage grouse population and the pronghorn population increases were positively correlated with cumulative acres treated over that period of time. So just to kind of wind it up, what have we learned about range treatments thus far? Sage grouse and pronghorn populations appeared to respond well to adding forbs in fawning and brood rearing areas. Both cattle and elk generally prefer finer native grasses to the coarser introduced wheatgrasses, although crested wheatgrass is readily eaten fall and spring. The only reason I say that is in the summer, both in the summertime and in the milder winters, they seem to prefer the finer native grasses to some of the coarser grasses. Now, we haven't had a hard winter yet, and that may change the way the elk use the landscape. So the pronghorn and sage grouse really responded well to the seedings. Cattle did well with it. The elk were a little bit of a disappointment thus far. They actually like some of our old seedings, the old crested wheatgrass seedings, better than some of the newer ones. And it may be because of location. Mule deer make significant use of burns, aerated, spiked, and alfalfa planted summer range areas, although we're not seeing a big population response. Brewer sparrows, sage sparrows, and sage thrashers continue to use aerated sagebrush sites following treatments. However, nest predation rates may be increasing. That's just some preliminary stuff. Russ Norvell has done a real good study of that, and we're gonna find out. So right now we're assuming there's going to be some negative nesting effects until the sagebrush recovers in some of these treatment areas. So the amount of area treated in a given year may be important if we want to keep good, solid, viable populations. Releasing native grasses by reducing brush density is generally preferable and more economical than planting exotics. Adding desirable forbs, especially legumes and browse species, has improved range nutrition, wildlife condition, and production. Alfalfa strips or patches function as surrogate meadows and provide critical nutrition during droughts. Forage kochia patches planted in old crested wheatgrass stands provide good winter protein sources for both cattle and elk. And just to finish up, as far as we can tell, we haven't lost either number of bird species or abundance. Essentially, these are the 3 breeding bird surveys we do on a ranch every year. Lumping them together, you can see we're maintaining the number of birds and the number of species. We need to focus in now on some of those sagebrush species. And, just to compare the number of AUMs eaten by big game and the number of AUMs eaten by cattle, both have increased through time. And we haven't, or put it this way, even with heavy harvests on elk, we've maintained big game abundance while basically doubling the number of cattle that we're running. I don't have the last couple of years on here, but we're running around 5,000 mother cows now. So we maintained big name numbers and doubled the cow herd. Some conclusions. Managing rangelands with a strategy of intermittent herbivory and rest paired with periodic predation of early to mid-cereal patches can maintain abundance and diversity. We think that properly managed conservation and livestock production aren't mutually exclusive. The revenues generated can benefit rural economies and allow conservation-minded ranchers to maintain private rangelands as open space. And finally, use sound science and good monitoring, but don't undervalue instinct and creativity. Albert Einstein once said, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant." Unfortunately, we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So, with that, I probably went over. I apologize.